Theodore Roosevelt is one of the most well-known presidents in U.S. history. He is the youngest president ever to serve and changed the political landscape forever.
Roosevelt was a Navy man who worked as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, mobilized the Navy in the Spanish-American War, wrote on naval history, and transformed the U.S. Navy into a modern, powerful, world-traveling fighting force.
One of the most famous naval actions that Roosevelt took was the creation and deployment of the Great White Fleet, a fleet of 16 battleships from the Atlantic Fleet and 14,000 sailors that sailed around the world between December 16, 1907 and February 22, 1909 to show the world America's power and influence. The fleet's journey was the first circumnavigation performed with an entire battle fleet.
The battleships in the Great White Fleet were the flagship, the USS Connecticut, the USS Louisiana, the USS Missouri, the USS Kentucky, the USS Kearsarge, the USS Kansas, the USS Georgia, the USS Virginia, the USS Illinois, the USS Ohio, the USS Minnesota, the USS Nebraska, the USS New Jersey, the USS Rhode Island, the USS Wisconsin, the USS Vermont, and later the USS Alabama and the USS Maine. These were large, well-armored, modern ships meant to increase the strength of the U.S. Navy. The fleet was also meant to help counter a new Japanese threat in the Pacific, in addition to the German threat in the Atlantic. The cruisers were the USS California, the USS Colorado, the USS Maryland, the USS Pennsylvania, the USS South Dakota, the USS Tennessee, the USS Washington, and the USS West Virginia. These cruisers were used to scout the path ahead before the Great White Fleet left. The Special Service Squadron, sometimes called the Pathfinders, consisted of the USS Washington and the USS Tennessee, was led by Admiral Seabury, and left 2 months before the Great White Fleet on October 12, 1907 from Hampton Roads. It later met up with the USS California and the USS South Dakota in Magdalena Bay. The USS Colorado, the USS Maryland, the USS Pennsylvania, and the USS West Virginia sailed to join the fleet when it arrived in San Francisco.
These ships were state-of-the-art in 1907 and showed the world how America had a powerful navy and advanced industry to build these ships. They were meant to counter a German threat in the Atlantic and a Japanese threat in the Pacific. 11 of the 16 battleships in the fleet were newly built, and they were meant to buff the Pacific Fleet, as there were only a few armored cruisers in the Pacific. Ultimately, a conflict with Japan was prevented, due to Japan accepting the Great White Fleet as a new era of American-Asian relations.
The Great White Fleet was headed by Rear Admiral Robley D. Evans at the first. The fleet started its journey in Hampton Roads, Virginia, on December 16, 1907. The fleet continued to Trinidad, West Indies, then to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, Sandy Point, Chile, Callao, Peru, Magdalena Bay, Mexico, then up to the West Coast, arriving in San Francisco on May 6, 1908.
In San Francisco, the USS Glacier was detached, and the USS Nebraska, led by Captain Reginald F. Nicholson, and the USS Wisconsin, led by Captain Frank E. Beatty, were substituted for the USS Maine and USS Alabama. This was due to the Maine and Alabama being very coal inefficient and requiring a lot of coal to run. Rear Admiral Charles A. Sperry also replaced Rear Admiral Evans as head of the fleet due to Evans's poor health due to gout. The fleet continued on to Honolulu, Hawaii, then to Auckland, New Zealand, then to Sydney, Australia, then to Melbourne, Australia, then to Albany, Australia, then to Manila, the Philippines, then to Yokohama, Japan, then to Colombo, Ceylon, then arriving in Suez, Egypt on January 3, 1909. In Egypt, word was received of an earthquake in Sicily, and the fleet went to help by giving aid to survivors.
The fleet left Messina on January 9, 1909, and continued to Naples, Italy, then to Gibraltar, and finishing at Hampton Roads, Virginia, on the 22nd of February, 1909. This trip was important for many reasons. It was the first circumnavigation with a full battle fleet, established the U.S. Navy as a global force, and was another factor in ending America's isolationism. The Great White Fleet also had modern battleships, influencing modern fleets for years to come.
The Great White Fleet cemented America as a world power in the eyes of the world's great colonial empires. Before the Spanish-American War, the U.S. was mostly isolationist, preferring to stay neutral in world affairs. Theodore Roosevelt believed that America had a role to spread freedom and get involved in world affairs. The Great White Fleet showed that America was not afraid to get involved in world affairs.
The Great White Fleet also began a new era of Asian affairs, as Japanese statesmen reacted positively to the U.S.'s new Pacific presence. When the U.S. ships entered the Pacific, the balance of power was changed forever.
The fleet gave America a presence in the Pacific and Asia in general. The U.S. had always wanted more trade power in China, and the Great White Fleet helped to form the Pacific Fleet, which gave the U.S. power in Asian trade.
Roosevelt's squadron system also set up modern fleet systems with coaling stations around the world, and the Panama Canal allowed the Navy to quickly travel between oceans. Secretary of the Navy Donald C. Winter has said that the Great White Fleet started America's tradition of naval superiority, saying that, now 100 years later, the future of the United States as a great nation continues to depend on our continued maritime superiority, which is still true today.
During the earthquake in Sicily, the Navy also helped the victims by giving humanitarian aid. The Navy still today has humanitarian aid as a large amount of its operations. For example, the Navy played a large role in the search for MH370 and gave humanitarian aid after Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines. Winters has said that, "We remember the Great White Fleet and the humanitarian relief aid they provided to Italy. We just returned from providing humanitarian aid to our own country. We should be proud to carry on the vision of Theodore Roosevelt."
The Great White Fleet also changed the design of battleships and other naval ships. For example, lessons learned during the voyage led to the elimination of guns near the ship's waterline, the removal of old-style fighting tops, and improvements to crew housing and ventilation systems. New fire control systems were installed on ships. The unnecessary skeleton fire control towers were also removed from the ships and replaced with military masts. The rough seas also showed a need for larger ships with a greater displacement. These design cues are still used in modern battleships and cruisers today. More cosmetic changes, like the paint of Navy ships changed from white to gray, were also put in effect after the Great White Fleet sailed. The voyage also proved that modern battleships could travel on very long journeys without suffering significant mechanical breakdowns. The voyage also gave experience to thousands of officers and men, led to improvements in coal economy, gunnery, and formation steaming. Modern ships powered by nuclear reactors can stay at sea for months and travel thousands of miles without refueling. The Navy also learned how to keep a ship self-sustaining. For example, the USS Triton submarine in 1960 performed a circumnavigation of the world completely underwater without stopping.
The Great White Fleet also changed the Navy from fighting in huge battles between empires to smaller, low-intensity conflicts to protect American interests. For example, earlier in 1903, Theodore Roosevelt sent U.S. warships to ensure Panama's independence so that the Panama Canal could be built. Today, the Navy participates in many smaller conflicts throughout the world, in the Middle East, Africa, Asia, and other places. The Naval Operations Concept 2010, NOC-10, is aimed at preventing conflict worldwide by using naval power to deter conflict, just as Theodore Roosevelt imagined. One sailor commented about the Great White Fleet, "We just wanted to let the world know we were prepared for anything they wanted to kick up. We wanted to show the world what we could do."
As you can see, the Great White Fleet was a turning point in U.S. naval history, influencing the design, organization, and the use of warships for years afterwards.
The Great White Fleet showed the world that America was powerful and that it would use that power for its interests. This was true throughout the 20th century, and it's still true today. The Navy is still an important part of the U.S. Armed Forces and American foreign policy, protecting American interests and providing humanitarian aid throughout the world.